In this lecture, we are going to go into a little more detail of the history of anthropological thought on race, and this is actually going to set us up really nicely for our topic we'll be covering next week, which is kind of a little bit of background on evolutionary history and kind of modern human biological diversity. So the questions that we'll be dealing with in this lecture is, how do we define a single species? Are there subspecies or races within humans, right? And can we scientifically examine the concept of race? When defining species, there's two broad definitions that I like to use, or that are kind of the most popular, most cohesive. We have the Ernst Mayr definition, which is any discrete population of potentially breeding organisms, which basically says that if an individual can have sex and produce offspring with another individual, they are in fact members of the same species. But we know today that that is not necessarily true, because we have things like zorses, right? Zebras and horses are genetically similar enough to where they can successfully breed with one another. They are two separate species, yet shared a common ancestor not so long ago, right? We also have George Gaylord Simpson's definition, which is any two creatures that can be shown to have a direct ancestor-descendant relationship, right? So if he's saying that if we can prove genetically that the fossil we dug out of the ground is genetically similar and identical to a modern creature, that it does not matter what changes occurred in the meantime, that they should in fact be considered the same species. So in essence, most of our early scientists, or the ones we'll be talking about at the very beginning here, were influenced by Platonic thought, right? That the different things shared a hidden essential nature no matter the variation that surrounds the aspect, right? And this is really based on kind of this notion of rationalism, right? That reason and observed evidence outweigh perceptions, right? So if you can, if you can observe a quote essential nature to things, then you it's proven to be both rational and scientific. So when we talk about notions of evolution, right, in terms of what we'll be discussing in this course, we define evolution as the changes in the forms of organic life that occurred throughout time since life has first arisen on Earth, right? Other scientists before Charles Darwin has discussed evolution, and some thought that species could change over time. As a matter of fact, the notion of evolution via natural selection was not exclusively Darwin's idea, right? It was actually based off of a lot of work that was done by his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, back in the 18th century. But before Darwin and before evolution via natural selection, naturalists and early scientists were heavily influenced by the Bible, right? So based on a study by Bishop Ussher, the believed scientific age of the Earth at that point was 4,004 years old. And the way Bishop Ussher did this is he went through the Bible, or the oldest version of the Bible, and counted the begots. Samuel married Sarah, and they had, Michael, John, and Luke, blah, blah, blah. So essentially what he did was he counted the generations, and that's what led him to the Earth being 4,004 years old, right? During this time, naturalists simply collected curiosities from across the globe without much real academic study. We kind of call this the age of antiquarianism, right? In the next picture over, you're going to see one of the earliest naturalist museums, which was created by Ole Worm, right? It's called the Worm Collection, and it actually still exists, and you can go and see it today. So before Darwin, all scientists were heavily influenced by this debate of polygenism versus monogeism, right? Was there one single creation event by God, or was there multiple creation events by God? In essence, what this really related to is this kind of notion called the great chain of being concept, which is the idea that you can rank species from simple to most complex, right? For example, the earliest schemas said that, plants were at the bottom, followed by invertebrates, and of course with humans being at the very top of the scale of creation, right? So a lot of these earliest naturalists who were monogenous believed that there was one creation point, that all species were created over time, and more importantly, that species were incapable. And whether you were a polygynist or monogynist, you believed this at the time, species were incapable of changing over time. Once they were created, that was it, and they never changed. So during this kind of early day of naturalism in the 16th and 17th centuries, we have the examination of nature in all of its aspects, right? In other places, we have a anatomist named Vasulius who dissected cadavers illegally. We have a gentleman named Harvey who determined how blood flowed within our circulatory system. And during this kind of post-Enlightenment period is when we see the rise of a revival in botany, right? And this was all influenced by Platonic thought, or this notion that you can find a rational, essential nature of things. So Andreas Vasulius was a Flemish anatomist who trained and taught at the University of Padua. He was jailed several times throughout his life for operating on human cadavers, because at that point in history, it was illegal for humans to be dissected after death, right? Most of the earliest doctors had to kind of learn about the internal anatomy of humans through using pigs, right? Because our internal anatomy is very similar. He published the world's first official book on human anatomy, and by the end of his life, Vasulius was advocating for physicians to stop using bloodletting as a cure for illness, right? So he even, based off of the work of Harvey, he even figured out kind of that this was not really a very good practice and was probably doing more harm than good. Later on in time, we see a revised age for the Earth, right? So in order for kind of the immense diversity of life forms that we see today to have arisen by natural selection, Darwin needed this kind of concept of deep time, which was provided by the geologists James Hutton and Charles Lyell, right? They were the first to really determine that the age is much, 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 much older than the 4,004 years that the study from Bishop Upshur states. Well, how do we know that the Earth is old? Well, it's the idea that the forces that change the Earth's crust now are the same forces that have helped shape it throughout time. This is called uniformitarianism, and we know by observing them today that these processes are often very slow and very gradual. Some of these processes that we look at are kind of these forces of erosion, as well as plate tectonics and volcanic activity. We look at earthquakes. We look at the effect that wind, water, and frost has on the Earth's surface, as well as decomposition. So the kind of prevailing, or what developed into the prevailing scientific thought based on the age of the Earth, developed these three kind of notions, right? The notion of catastrophism, that volcanoes, floods, and earthquakes are examples of catastrophic events that were once believed to be responsible for mass extinctions, but we know that they are responsible for the formation of a lot of the landforms, right? We also have gradualism. Canyons are carved by rivers, slow, gradual change, right? It's the idea that changes in the Earth occurred by small steps over a long, long period of time, right? And then, of course, we have uniformitarianism, which is that rock strata demonstrate the geological processes which are still occurring today, add up to over long periods of time to cause great change, right? So in essence, uniformitarianism is this notion that the Earth is laid down in very gradual, uniform layers. Along with uniformitarianism, we have the law of superposition in geology, which states that the layers on the closer to the surface are younger than layers towards the bottom, right? So essentially, the further down you dig into the Earth, the older and farther back in time you are going. This is basically the foundation of modern archaeology. Another prominent scientist that you are all very familiar with, or should be familiar with, that had a lot of influence into towards kind of pushing the notion of a real scientific examination of humans, right, beyond this kind of Platonic essentialism, right? So he was a Swedish botanist who essentially agreed with the Great Chain of Being concept. He never traveled outside of Europe. The schema he made was gathered from data that was gathered from missionaries and travelers, and he believed that it was a naturalist duty to study the fixed nature of the universe. And Carl Linnaeus is one of the first to come up with a racial classification system for humans, but he didn't call them a different species. He called them subspecies, right? So they were all human. They were just different subspecies of human. Right, so Linnaeus developed our Linnaean scientific binomial nomenclature system for animals and plants, right? You know, species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, et cetera, et cetera. He also tried to classify humans, right? And what made it distinct from any of the earlier classifications that we see, like Bernier, is that he actually assigned personality traits and behavioral tendencies to his classification system. So if you were Americanus, your skin was red, you were choleric and erect. If you were Asiaticus, your skin was sallow, a little yellow. And you were dignified and avaricious and ruled by opinion rather than by custom or law, right? He even had a few made-up categories like troglodytes and monstrous, right? The giants and the mutants, which we have yet to find. A little later on, we have Comte De Bouffan, who was a contemporary of Linnaeus and tried to popularize the term race over the Linnaean term subspecies. He believed in the geographic and climatic origin of race. So, example, Africans, this is his own words, Africans have dark skin because the sun has, quote, burned them, right? And he also believed in the fixity of species, right? So before Darwin, any of these real examinations of humans basically tried to categorize them into different races and then asserted that, well, these personality traits are exclusive to this race and that they cannot be changed. Their physiology cannot be changed because all species are fixed. So if we looked at one of our earlier gentlemen that we talked about in our last lecture, we have George S Cuvier, who's known as the father of paleontology. He collected large quantities of fossils all around Europe, and he was the person who proposed the notion of catastrophism, which we just covered. And he kind of chimed in on the Linnaean debate, saying that he was claiming that Africans were anatomically closer to orangutans than were Europeans. Therefore, they were of a different race or a different species. So in essence, kind of Cuvier framed human evolution in terms of his catastrophic or catastrophism. He believed that the original race of humans were white, of course, more closely relating to white Europeans, and the other races arose from the survivors of Noah's flood and other catastrophes, right? So in essence, these catastrophes by God created mass extinction events, and out of which arose these new species of humans, which we know today that that is entirely not how it happened, and a little bit fantastical, but essentially that was his prevailing thought, right? Using these catastrophes outlined in the Bible as a way to, or as kind of a stopping or a starting point for new special change. So in essence, Cuvier took minor differences in skeletal anatomy and used them to create a racial system which mirrored social inequality, which of course Caucasians or Europeans being the more white and being closer to God, being the original race created before all the catastrophic events. And then of course Mongolians being related to Asians and Ethiopians being related to Africans. And a lot of these kind of more colder theories, or at least like a little less socially conscious theories that have occurred during this time were really kind of the result or very heavily influenced by a guy named Thomas Malthus and the development of the field of demography, right? And Malthus wrote about these notions of population increase, that populations will always grow faster than food supplies, which leads to a struggle for existence. Not all will survive. So in essence, Malthus's work later led to something known as social Darwinism, which was actually a primary proponent of the eugenics movement. It's saying that the effects of crowding and food shortage are not random on whom they kill. The people who are physically, genetically, and have a weaker constitution are at greater risk, right? So you're kind of seeing that this is, if you kind of expound upon this idea, it's almost a notion that, well, we are wealthy, successful, and healthy because we are genetically better than people who are poor and people who get sick and things like that, right? They kind of take society or culture and how, social construction, they take that out of the equation entirely, right? So you can kind of see how this was really latched onto by a lot of prominent wealthy people as a justification for why poor people exist, right? It's not due to human greed. It's not due to social inequality. It's simply due to those people being dumber and weaker due to their genetic disposition. Another prominent individual is Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, right? He had based his assertions off of Platonic reasoning. He added a fifth category to the Linnaean racial classification system, Malayan. He stuck strictly to anatomical differences and did not use cultural or temperament in his category system. And he's really the one who coined the term Caucasian, right? He recognized variation, but still believed in the fixity of species, right? Or that species were incapable of change, and still believed that Africans were distinct subspecies as well as Europeans. Then we have Louis Agassiz, who is a Swiss and American naturalist and biologist, and he is actually a fairly prominent figure. He actually sat on a lot of committees kind of during the mid-1800s in the United States, which had a lot of influence on education policies and government programs that were offered to low-income neighborhoods and things like that. He was an ardent racist, and this actually was the result. He never really wrote about race or anything like that until he had an interaction with a bellhop at a Philadelphia hotel who he claims was rude to him, and he took that unpleasant experience and basically said that all people of African descent were dumb and brutish and blah, blah, blah. In essence, he believed Africans were intellectually and physically inferior. He supported the notion of polygenism, which is the multiple creationist events. None of his assertions were actually based on science, but he sat on those committees and informed and helped with education programs and government policies. And his suggestions to the U.S. government for programs said that whites should be trained for managerial and government positions, whereas blacks should be trained for manual labor, right? So you can see, and I cannot stress enough how much influence Louis Agassiz had in the American scientific community at the time. It's kind of depressing to look back at it now. So to wrap up 18th and 19th century thought on race, most scientists were conducting research that was heavily influenced by the Bible. Before Darwin, the goal was to verify the historical accounts in the Bible. Another goal was to create racial categories which justified social inequality that was present at the time. There was a consistent belief that species were considered fixed, and all scientific frameworks were based on the great chain of being concept. One of our early 20th century racists was Ernest Hooton from 1887 to 1954. He used Samuel Morton's craniometry methods and said that racial traits were a matter of inheritance, right? He sat on the Committee of the Negro, which was funded by Congress to prove racial inferiority at the time, around the mid-1920s. And he was a large supporter of eugenics, right? And by his own words, he says, there is no anthropological ground whatsoever for selecting any so-called racial groups, or any ethnic or national group, or any linguistic or religious group for preferment and condemnation. Our real purpose should be to segregate and eliminate the unfit, worthless, degenerate, and antisocial portion of each racial and ethnic strain in our population, so that we may utilize the substantial merits of the sound majority and the special and diversified gifts of its superior members, right? So as a supporter of eugenics, what Hooton was really saying is that some government entity or some group of scientists gets to decide what's considered good traits, what's considered healthy traits, what's considered productive, and what's considered preferable. And anything that doesn't fit that schema or that category should be denied the ability to reproduce and thus keep those traits, quote unquote, from passing to the next generation, right? So we know this is based on a huge oversimplification of Darwinian evolution, and we know that behavioral tendencies are not genetically determined. So this is, but this was the prevailing thought during this kind of eugenics movement. So going into a little more detail on the countercurrent running at the time, which was mainly contributed by people like W.E.B. Du Bois and Franz Boas, we have the notion of cultural relativism, which was starting to gain traction. This is defined as understanding a group's beliefs, living structure, and traditions within their own cultural context without making judgment or placing value. We have the debunking of biological determinism, which is the notion that all attributes of a person are innate, including intelligence, brain size, and et cetera, right? So we have people like Hooton and earlier proponents like Bouffan and Linnaeus and others arguing that, you know, a race and intelligence and behavioral tendencies are biologically determined. And then during this kind of early 20th century period, we start to see people like W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as Ashley Montague, as well as Franz Boas rejecting this and providing case studies which support their assertions. We also have historical particularism, which rejects the notion that cultures evolve. It instead argues that each society or culture is a collective representation of its own unique historical past, rather than following some sort of predetermined cultural trajectory. So if we look at one of Boas's case studies, which really cemented the notion that biological determinism was not good science, he really wanted to test Darwinian evolution as well as refute Morton's craniometry, or the notion that you can measure intelligence based on skull size. He studied 18,000 immigrants that were coming in at Ellis Island. He looked at skull sizes and limb proportions and found that American skull sizes vary significantly from European or African skulls. But what made this study fundamental, more important, is that he went to those families that he measured 10 years later and looked at the children that had been born to those parents. And he looked at the after 10 years, those children had American size skull proportions, right? So really there was no genetic inheritant component to skull size. What it was really showing was that environment, things like diet, nutrition, and disease pressure and things like that, those all have significant effects on skull sizes and things like that, right? So he really found that it was more diet that really causes changes in people's skulls, not intelligence, not heredity, not anything like that. We also have Frank B. Livingstone from 1928 to 2005, and he looked at the clinal variation in human traits like skin tone and blood types, right? And he took it from an evolutionary perspective, and he concluded that biological races cannot possibly exist. There's too much variation, and there's too much overlap between human groups. So his primary research interest was in abnormal hemoglobin or abnormal blood genes in humans. So we also have Marvin Harris from 1927 to 2001, and he studied the notions of human rationale for religious practices in India and South America, who refuted the notion of sociobiology, that societies are biologically determined, right? And he coined the term hypodescent, marking a social pattern in U.S. government policies that had up until that point really had been unrecognized, right? It's the whole notion that when you have a child of an interrace couple, the race of the minority parent is automatically assigned to the child. So, for example, if you have a white woman and a black man that get married and they have a child, that child is automatically considered black by both the government and by the wider culture around, instead of, there being any real debate about it. So in essence, in the U.S. culture, racial identity is acquired at birth, right? It's a form of ascribed status, or status that you are given based on your birth, right? It is not based on biology or simple ancestry. If you have 50%, black from the mom or 50% from a white dad, the child's automatically classified as black, right? It's an arbitrary classification operating under the rule of descent, right? Which assigns social identity based on the basis of ancestry, right? So the effects that hypodescent has, that divides U.S. society into groups unequal in their access to wealth, power, and prestige. Population growth attributed more to minority categories, because every time you have an interracial couple, that counts as a growth in minority population rather than majority population. It's easier for Native Americans or Hispanics to negotiate identity than for black people to negotiate identity. So blacks are more disproportionately affected by the rule of hyperdescent than many other racial quote-unquote categories. If we look at a few famous examples, we have President Obama, or former President Obama, who had a Kenyan father and a white American mother, but he is considered black. We also have a very famous case of from Louisiana of Susie Guillory Phipps, right? In some states, anyone known to have any black ancestor can be classified as a member of the black race, right? So in the case of Susie Phipps, she was a light-skinned woman with Caucasian features and straight black hair. She was raised white. As an adult, she found out she was part black from her birth certificate. So this, she challenged the Louisiana 132nd law because they had automatically classified her as black, but lost, right? This is a rare case because race is usually ascribed at birth and does not change, right? Hers was on her birth certificate, but she was raised based on her physical features, not ancestry. So this just further proves that race is an arbitrary category. Another kind of counter current running at the time, and author of one of your books for this course is Stephen J. Gould. He refuted the notion of sociobiology, contributed the notion of punctuated equilibrium in evolution, which we'll talk about later. He reran both Samuel Morton and Louis Agassiz's data and found significant flaws in scientific work, claiming that Africans had smaller skulls and brain sizes. In some cases, particularly with Samuel Morton's work, he actually, when the numbers were run correctly, found quite the opposite, that Africans on average had larger skull sizes than European groups. He contributed NOMA, this non-overlapping magisterium, which is a very fancy a way of saying that religion and science do not necessarily have to be combative to one another, right? Religion seeks to explain things that science cannot explain, right? Whereas science seeks to explain things that are readily observable in our world, right? And he also refuted the notion of the bell curve, which he speaks a lot about in your book, and we'll talk about much more detail later. We also have William Montague Cobb from 1904 to 1990. He's another counter-current individual. In 1932, he studied the famous runner, Jesse Owens, took physical measurements, and also conducted IQ testing on Owens, and claimed that genes have no role in intelligence, and that Owens' running ability is not linked to his African genes, as was argued by German officials when they tried to exclude him from the Olympics occurring at the time. So as we move through the semester, we're going to start to see that different cultures have very different categories on race, right? For example, if we use Brazil, they have very broad categories. They have the Luras, the Brancas, the Morenas, which are seen as white in Brazil but are black/African in the U.S. An example, I guess, would be Halle Berry. Mulattoes, pears, and many others. So if you take a plane from New York to Brazil, your race can actually change based on how each culture, how each country defines racial categories. So to talk a little bit about the eugenics movement, which we'll revisit a few times this semester, as well as it's in the documentary you should be watching for this week for your assignment. The word itself was coined by Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's Charles Darwin's cousin. There were 30 plus versions around the world, right? So it wasn't just an American distinct institution. And organizations of social reformers, biologists, doctors, and other professional experts participated in this, right? It was considered politically and scientifically progressive to apply this new science of human genetics to control or engineer population health and fitness. And it also had an economic rationale to reduce the burden of welfare services and increase efficiency by removing undesirable people from your society, right? But we all know, as members of a culture, as members of society, and if we look at any serious student of history, will tell you that there has always been inequality in human society. So if we were to follow this rationale to the end and we remove all of the burdensome people within society, then who will the have-nots be? Who will be the people denied access to equal wealth at that point? So eugenics in and of itself, the movement, once it came to its culmination, was a targeted movement, right? In 1906, Indiana passed the first forced sterilization law, and soon there were many states to follow. California currently has the highest number of forced sterilizations historically, and it was generally done on people in mental health facilities for a variety of reasons. Men, it was done to curb their aggressiveness, and for women, it was done to curb reproductive ability, right? Native American women were targeted all the way up until the 1980s. A lot of them were sterilized forcibly without them even knowing, right? And a lot of those reservations, young women would go to the reservation hospital for their first gynecological exam, and that doctor would sterilize them without their knowledge using this specific cream that they apply. Between 1970 and 1980, the number of sterilizations rose from 200,000 to about 700,000 historically. And it was not a race-specific thing, right? It's not. I don't want you to think that this was basically a bunch of white folks, even though most of it was predominantly white scientists and politicians and things. But there were also people of color that supported the eugenics movement as well. One of them is Thelma Burlack Boozer from 1906 to 2001. She worked as a journalist for the New York Amsterdam News and published the work Birth Control Gained Sanction in 1934. She said, with more well-born babies, fewer ill-born babies, and sterilization of those unfit to become parents will aid society in solving some of its major problems, right? So a lot of these people thought that they were doing genuine good in kind of pushing these forced sterilization policies across the U.S. So if we look at why eugenics occurred, right, it's based on that false notion of biological progression, right? It was both a legislative as well as a cultural movement, and it was practiced by both black and white organizations, right? Native Americans were secretly sterilized at reservation hospitals. So in essence, if there was one group that was targeted without their knowledge and without their participation, it was Native Americans. All other groups, whether you were African American or whether you were white or Asian, all had organizations that participated a little bit in this eugenics movement during the time. So if we look at some of our modern thoughts on race, of course, we revisit the bell curve, which I really like to refer to as junk science. It was developed in the 1990s by Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, and they sought to link intelligence, race, IQ, and heritability, right? And they said that low IQ leads to bad social outcomes like poverty, crime, and out-of-wedlock births, right? So that low IQ people, who are more often found in non-white than white groups, are having more children than high IQ people, and that should, they state that policy should reflect that reality, right? Well, we know that given the examination by Stephen J. Gould in the Shaker school system, that it really isn't actually race, has nothing to do with it. It's really resources and community, right? How much effort and how much resources is being put into education within the local community. So race in anthropology today goes from a social constructivist approach. There's a recognition of the inequality produced by racial categories, but there's also a recognition that there is no biological base for race, only social construction. So race is real in terms of social treatment and healthcare, but not real in terms of a biological reality, right? So no group of people is or has ever been biologically, homogeneously, or pure, right? Furthermore, human populations are not and have never been biologically discrete, truly isolated, nor fixed. If we look at another individual, we have Leith Mullings from 1942 to present. She studied women in Harlem and found Harlem had twice the national infant mortality rate. She also found similar patterns in other low-income, predominantly black neighborhoods, and concluded that racism is pervasive in multiple social structures like healthcare and social programs. So it's not just how people treat one another when they're casually interacting with one another on the street, right? It also is very pervasive in our institutional systems like healthcare and education. So in essence, what Mullins was looking at, as well as many other anthropologists today, are looking at the intersection of health and economy, right? That health transitions are not equal across all communities, and a health transition is defined as the incorporation of modern medical advancements made in the 20th century into their health system. And life expectancy cross-culturally is a prime example of health disparities, right? So in a field called critical medical anthropology, we treat health systems as power systems and examine how health disparities form. So it focuses on access to healthcare and the quality of healthcare provided across human groups. So if we look at another case study in critical medical anthropology, and more importantly, looking at how the intersection of notions of race intersect with healthcare, right? She looked at a woman named Kiara Bridges examined a women's healthcare clinic in Alpha Hospital in New York City. And after 1.5 years of observation, she noticed systemic discrimination based on perceived attitudes presented by the medical staff of the clinic. So, i.e., or in other words, women of low income were subjected to more intrusive medical procedures and more intrusive interviews as part of being labeled as an at-risk patient by the Medicaid system. So the difference in the quality and access to healthcare leads to varying infant mortalities based on your social group, right? So basically what we're saying is that, race is real in the sense that it provides very real differences in access to things like healthcare and education. And racial categories have shifted quite a bit throughout time in the United States, right? And some people that are considered quote unquote white today were not considered quote unquote white when they first arrived here, right? Today, people of European descent are considered Caucasian or white, but when the Irish, Greek, and Italian people first arrived in the U.S., they were seen as a separate and inferior race, right? So racial categories are actively created and adjusted throughout time to affirm and reinforce social hierarchies. So the moral of the story here is that racial categories are used to create divisions within populations and maintain social inequality. An example of a cultural institution which uses racial categories to perpetuate classism is the notion of hypodescent, or automatically assigning the race to children of interracial couples that we talked about earlier in this lecture. So why do racial categories change throughout time? Well, in a general sense, racial categories are used to maintain those hierarchies, but also to assign blame for social problems, right? In sociology, this practice is known as scapegoating, right? Think of back to why racial categories were created in the first place, right? For example, in the late 19th century, when we had a lot of Irish immigrants coming over to the United States, alcoholism and domestic violence were seen as Irish problems, right? And that was seen as something that didn't affect the white race. It only affected the, quote, Irish race, right? In the 1930s, you had African Americans being scapegoated for marijuana and cocaine use among whites, right? It wasn't, white people perpetuating the use of it. It was being brought in and forcibly forced upon their communities by people of a different race. So in essence, racism is a complex system of power that draws upon culturally constructed racial categories to rank people as either being inferior or superior, right? So remember, as we move through the semester, racial categories are created by the majority or those who are in power. They are used to maintain power and have no actual basis in biology or real science. What has led to people believing that there is a basis in real science or biology is the fact that early scientists used very bad science and fraudulent data to help those people in power maintain their power and create those racial categories. So today we recognize there being two distinct types of racism, right? The individual racism, which is based on a person's taught beliefs on race and manifests in the form of disrespect, outward aggression, and suspicion, right? And we all have seen that very, very prevalently in our society today. We also have institutional racism, which are patterns by which racial inequality is perpetuated through policies, institutions, and systems like Jim Crow laws or the disproportionate population of African Americans in the prison system. Both of these things, in the current kind of aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, we are literally seeing all of these individual and institutional racial trends within our society coming to the forefront. So this, in my opinion, this is an excellent time for us to really address these trends within our society and to try and create policies and mechanisms to really derail this whole system of racism that we've helped perpetuate over the course of our country's history. So in recent times, and I'm assuming it's going to become far more prevalent over the next couple weeks as protesting continues and things like that. In recent times, people have kind of really taken a stance that equality can result from being colorblind, right? That if we simply ignore the fact that there are races, then equality will just kind of follow naturally. Unfortunately, adopting this stance ignores a century of legal racism and institutional inequality, which has established an uneven playing field primarily in economy, right? So to say that race doesn't exist really is kind of ignoring the fact that since there is that history of racism and all that institutional racism has created an unlevel playing field that has not been rectified. There has not been enough change and enough time has passed and enough non-racists have been operating in power to where that system could really work, right? So at this point, we can't say we're colorblind, right? Races exist simply because we have created them, we have created institutions around them, and we have forced inequality using them. So until that inequality disappears, we cannot ignore race, or in other words, until the inequality based on race disappears, we cannot, fall back on the true biological notion and say that race doesn't exist, right? Culturally, socially, and in terms of institutions and policies, race still exists, very much alive in the United States today.